Hey folks, Brian Keene here with you in the woods behind my home with a copy of Why I Love Horror, a new book edited by my pal Becky Spratford. Why I Love Horror is a collection of nonfiction essays by some of the biggest names in modern horror fiction, in which they write personal essays about why they love the genre, what attracted them to it, why they stick with it, why they write it, etc. It's a who's who, table of contents wise, and I apologize if I get anyone's name wrong, but Haley Piper, John Langan, Alma Katsu, Gabino Iglesias, Tananarive Dew, Jennifer McMahon, Josh Mallerman, Paul Tremblay, Grady Hendrix, Cynthia Palaio, Clay McLeod Chapman, Nuzo Ono, Rachel Harrison, Victor Laval, Mary San Giovanni, Keene, also behind the camera. And I noticed you never use Keene when you publish something, San Giovanni, but that's probably for another video, right?
Probably.
Probably. David Demchuk, Stephen Graham Jones, and of course me, Brian Keene. Depending on when you're watching this, the book is on sale in stores nationwide September of 2025. That could be next month. It could have been 5 years ago. It all depends on when you're watching this and where you're watching it. But I thought what I would do today, with Becky's permission, is read you my essay from the book, and you will learn a little bit about me. You'll learn a little bit about why I do this and why I love this genre and why I fight for this genre. This is called Brian Keene's Giant Size Man Thing. You know what? Let's get rid of this, because that is going to bother me.
Cleaning up nature and fighting for horror.
Now I got bugs in my hair. Or maybe the bugs were there beforehand. Anyway, in the early 1970s, I was a young kid in rural central Pennsylvania. Although I didn't know it at the time, America was going through one hell of an existential crisis. Over the previous decade, our country had nearly torn itself apart over the Vietnam War, Watergate, the Kent State shootings, and the cold-blooded assassination of such figures as Martin Luther King Jr., the Kennedy brothers, and Malcolm X. There were numerous more horrors visited upon us in that time, but to list them all here is to get off into the weeds. And besides, this book isn't about why I love real-life horrors. It's about why I love horror as a genre. Suffice to say, as a country, we'd just come perilously close to collapsing, and the divisions revealed in the aftermath of that social, moral, and political upheaval were like great deep fissures, still belching smoke and hellfire if you stood too close to them. To this day, I don't think there has been a complete examination of the toll that era had on our collective and individual psyches. But as an adult, and with the benefit of the wisdom that hindsight offers, I can see the impact it had on my parents, the parents of my friends, and the other adults in town. Be it the complete and wanton surrender to drugs, alcohol, or desperately casual sex, or the quiet but no less demoralizing withdrawal into depression, anxiety, or full-blown PTSD, the adults weren't all right. Maybe the kids were all right back in 1966 when The Who released a song proclaiming such, but by 1976, those same kids were grown up and fucked up. Horror as a genre has always reflected our times. It's a mirror darkly, to be sure, but it always gets things right. When you consider what the genre was reflecting back to us in the 1970s, the early novels of folks like Stephen King and James Herbert, movies like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Exorcist, and Eaten Alive, that mirror was obsidian. My friends and I wandered this American wasteland as half-feral children, roaming unsupervised as far as our bikes could take us, consuming media and substances completely inappropriate for our age, and having a grand old time doing it. Some of my friends had horrible home lives. I knew kids who were abused physically, some who were abused mentally and emotionally, and at least one who was possibly abused sexually. We didn't talk about it back then. We lacked the maturity or verbal skills to do so, but we were aware. We'd all heard Charlie Rich's 1973 hit Behind Closed Doors because radio stations were still playing it in 1976. But while the song itself is about sex, we knew there were all sorts of other things that went on behind closed doors as well. Things we didn't discuss, but things that cast a shadow over everything, regardless. Now, my home life wasn't nearly as bad as many of the other kids. Sure, corporal punishment was still very much a thing in our home. I got hit by an assortment of belts, wooden spoons, and my least favorite, a fly swatter with a wire handle. But my parents weren't abusive. They both did the best they could, and let's be honest, I wasn't exactly a model youth of purity and dignity. Mostly, my parents were struggling with things bigger than my childhood mind could comprehend. My father's time in Vietnam and on riot duty when he returned home, the death of my mother's brother just a few years before, an economic recession and gas crisis, and other stuff. As a result of all that, my parents could be distant at times. As an adult, I know what my friends were trying to stay away from behind their closed doors. I suspect that for me, it was that distance that I was trying to avoid. Or perhaps trying to fill a void. And the way I did that was through comic books. I loved comic books. Any money I made went right toward buying comic books. Any free moment I had, I was reading comic books on the school bus, while fishing, in all the various clubhouses and forts we built in the woods over the years, under the covers at night with a flashlight long after I was supposed to be asleep, on long car rides during family trips, on vacation, in church. My sources were many and varied. Once a week, I rode my bike into town and bought brand new comics at the local newsstand for 35 to 50 cents each. On Sundays, I'd ride my bike to the flea market in another nearby town and buy older comics at a price of $5 for $1. Whenever we went on family trips, which were always either to visit our kin in West Virginia or to spend a week at the beach at Ocean City, Maryland, I'd hit up 7-Eleven and Stuckey's, often because they used a different distributor from my local newsstands, and thus they had comics that I normally couldn't find. I read anything I could get my hands on. Superheroes like Captain America and the Falcon, Batman, Amazing Spider-Man, Incredible Hulk, supervillain team-up, Superman, Iron Man, Marvel 2-in-1, Marvel Team-Up, The Phantom, Justice League, and The Defenders. Funny books like Beetle Bailey, Sad Sack, Bugs Bunny, Mad, Cracked, and Crazy, of course, and the seemingly never-ending variety of Archie titles. Educational comics like Classics Illustrated and Marvel's knockoff of the same concept. Freebies that Radio Shack used to hand out about subjects like electronics and rocketry. Westerns such as Billy the Kid and Jonah Hex. War comics like Sergeant Rock and Sergeant Fury. Sci-fi and fantasy titles like Commandy, Last Boy on Earth, Conan the Barbarian, Tarzan, Dagar, and Turok, Son of Stone. Media franchises like Planet of the Apes, Twilight Zone, Star Wars, Welcome Back, Kotter, and 2001. And horror comics. So many horror comics. My God, stuff like Weird War, Weird Western, House of Secrets, House of Mystery, Witching Hour, Chamber of Chills, Creature on the Loose, Werewolf by Night, and of course, the Swamp Creatures. DC's Swamp Thing and Marvel's Man Thing. The Man Thing is the earliest example of why I love horror, in that it was 2 of his comic appearances that made me fall in love with the genre, resulting in me not only becoming a lifelong fan of horror, but being blessed enough to make my living from it as well. My introduction to the character occurred when I was in 4th grade. I spent the night at another kid's house, and after his parents had fallen asleep, we stayed up super late, reading his stack of comic books and a few Hustler magazines he'd pilfered from his father's dresser drawer. The only thing I remember about the latter is my surprise that they had cartoons and comics in between the pictures of very naked women, and that seeing those pictures of very naked women simultaneously excited me and filled me with an absolute certainty that I would surely burn in hell. But while I may have only had the vaguest recollections, regarding those Hustler magazines, I can remember every single vivid detail about those two Man-Thing comic books I read that night. The first one was issue 12 of Fear, written by Steve Gerber, with art by Jim Starlin and inks by Rich Buckler. I recognized Gerber's name right away. At the time, he was writing my favorite comic book, The Defenders. Earlier that year, I'd read issue 33 of The Defenders and had just been utterly blown away by the entire thing. When I started to read it again, I noticed the little creator credit box and saw that it had been written by Steve Gerber and drawn by Sal Buscema. And it had clicked in my mind. These were jobs that you could have as an adult. You could make a living not by farming, not by working in the paper mill like my dad and all his friends, but by making up stories. I'd read enough comics in the months since then to know that Gerber was my favorite writer. Given my age, I didn't recognize the other two names. Jim Starlin would go on to become comic book royalty, celebrated for his run on Captain Marvel, the creation of Thanos, and the eventual miniseries, The Infinity Gauntlet, and many other career highlights. And Rich Buckler was a name I'd come to later revere almost as much as Gerber's. He co-created one of my favorite Defenders characters, Devil Slayer, which, many decades later, was the very first character I ever wrote for Marvel Comics. But little Brian didn't know any of that. Little Brian didn't know that he too would one day write for these same companies, or that upon the publication of his first novel, The Rising, he would exchange correspondence with Steve Gerber himself. Little Brian just knew that he liked comics, and he liked Gerber's comics in particular. And this one had a cool-looking monster on the cover. The story tells the plight of Mark Jackson, one of the few black people living in Topeka, Florida. He's the victim of a racially motivated crime, and he's being pursued by a corrupt and racist white sheriff. The two characters cross paths with the Man-Thing, who was once Ted Sallis, a scientist attempting to recreate the formula that gave Captain America his powers. Now, Sallis is a moss-encrusted mockery of a man, a monster comprised of mud and slime and roots, a shambling and mindless creature with an empathic nature. The Man-Thing, you see, is drawn to emotions, particularly negative emotions like hatred and the animosity that Mark and the sheriff feel towards each other. But there's one emotion that causes Man-Thing insufferable pain: fear. And whatever knows fear burns at the Man-Thing's touch. In the time it took me to read that comic book, I'd had my first lesson in racism, both institutionalized and blatant, and my first indication that, unlike what my teachers and my parents were telling me, not all authority figures were good people. Indeed, some of them were monsters. Because make no mistake about it, that issue of Fear may have starred a monster in the character of Man-Thing, but it was the sheriff who was the real monster. Then, I grabbed the next comic off my friend's stack, the amusingly titled Giant Size Man-Thing, issue number 4. The term giant size referred to the page count, which was 68 rather than the normal 24. Marvel published many of these, but giant-sized Spider-Man or giant-sized Conan didn't elicit giggles the way giant-sized Man-Thing did. My laughter dried up after reading the first page. And those first few caption boxes, Steve Gerber, aided by a wondrously sinister splash page by Ed Hannigan and Ron Wilson, tells us that, quote, "It is just past noon, but the sky over the Everglades is midnight black and indigo, laced with silvery streaks of lightning. A savage wind reaps through the leafy canopy that shrouds the swamp in shadow, and the macabre Man-Thing peers upward through the torn curtain of nature's fury." End quote. Some shit was about to go down. And boy, did it ever. Giant-Sized Man-Thing issue 4 tells the story of a kid named Edmund, a social outcast who'd been bullied or ignored by almost everyone in his life. His parents, his grandmother, his classmates, his high school gym teacher. Indeed, the latter pushed and berated Edmund into running laps to the point that this kid collapses and dies of a heart attack. At Edmund's funeral, it's revealed that one of his few friends, a girl named Alice, has possession of his journal. which details the transgressions of his abusers. Alice intends to publish the journal in the school paper, but before she can, the adults conspire to kidnap her. They string her up in the school gym, threatening to torture her if she doesn't reveal the journal's location. You see, these are all the good people about town. Edmund's revelations from beyond the grave would destroy their standing. Before Alice can be harmed, or probably killed, the Man-Thing shows up, possibly guided by Edmund's restless spirit. And he tears through these human monsters. Now remember, whatever knows fear burns at the Man-Thing's touch, and these adults are very fucking afraid. He burns shut the mouth of Edmund's mother, who never spoke up in her son's defense. He breaks the back of Edmund's father, a man who was always metaphorically on his son's back. And the coach, that heartless, belligerent bully of a gym coach, the Man-Thing drags him out onto the track and proceeds to burn right through his chest, searing through layers of flesh and muscle and bone until he ultimately chars the man's heart in two. And that, folks, that was the moment that I fell in love with horror. The Man-Thing was a monster, but he wasn't the real monster. Now, as I said earlier, I knew as soon as I read that first comic book, Defenders issue 33, that writing was what I wanted to do when I grew up. My friends all had their hearts set on being baseball players or cops or Evel Knievel or the $6 Million Man, but I was already training for my grown-up job. I produced dozens of comic books, sitting there at the coffee table in our living room with pencils and a box of crayons, laboring over sheets of paper my father brought home from the mill. I started out with pastiches, creating new adventures for Captain America and the Falcon, Commandy, Spider-Man, the Defenders. But once I'd been exposed to Giant-Sized Man-Thing issue 4, I began leaning toward horror, started inventing characters and monsters of my own. Not long after, on another weekly trip to the newsstand, the latest issue of Marvel's Bizarre Adventures caught my eye. According to the cover, it had an adaptation of Stephen King's The Lawnmower Man. Now, I didn't know who this Stephen King guy was, but Lawnmower Man, he sounded like a cool comic book villain, so I bought it, and I took it home, and I read it. I didn't entirely understand it. I wouldn't read Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan until many years later, but it struck a chord in me regardless. I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen when the Lawnmower Man gobbles up the dead gopher. But what really intrigued me was the overall sense of menace, of an ancient, inexplicable evil rubbing shoulders with a modern America that I knew all too well. It was like Giant-Sized Man-Thing in that regard. Many of the other horror comics I'd read took place in old castles or lonely mountaintops, but these two stories, horror stories, took place in locations I recognized. I'm going to pause for a moment. Mary, you look concerned. Is the battery dying or something?
No.
No? Okay. Now we'll continue. When I rode my bike back to the newsstand a week later, I saw a paperback book on my way to the comic book spinner rack. The cover showed a bandaged hand, like something you'd see on a mummy, and it was pockmarked with eyes. The book was Stephen King's Night Shift, an important, seminal, historic publication. Like Giant-Sized Man-Thing, it was full of places and people I recognized. The blue-collar guys slaving away at the factory and fighting mutant rats. The apathetic teenagers partying as the world ended. The cast of gray matter, who could very well have been members of my own family. And so many more. Many of the characters in those stories were as bad as the horrors visited upon them. But perhaps even more important to me than the stories themselves was the book's foreword, in which Steve King talked about writing for a living. I read Night Shift from cover to cover, and then I read it again. But I read that foreword a third and fourth time. And soon after, instead of just writing my own comic books, I started experimenting with writing stories. On my next trip to the newsstand, I brought home a paperback of Salem's Lot. F. Paul Wilson's The Keep followed soon after, then James Herbert's Rat series. Movies, too, watched late at night on the tiny black and white TV in my room. Phantasm, Jaws, Dawn of the Dead, The Omen, Omen 2, and The Car. Horror had its hooks in me, and there was no turning back. This genre has brought me a lot of comfort over the years, and it all goes back to that little kid in the 1970s who knew that the world was off, who knew that it wasn't a Disney cartoon, but didn't understand how he knew or what was actually going on. Bad things were happening behind closed doors to kids that I knew, and I was powerless to do anything about it. Well, I could escape into the safety of make-believe monsters. The nightly news said somebody called Russia wanted to nuke us. I could escape into the safety of radioactive mutants. 3 Mile Island, just a few short miles away from where we are right now, was melting down. That was okay. I could hide between the covers of something scary, but less scary than that. Horror, as a marketing category, always does better in times of national or global turmoil. The sales data backs this up, as do the trends in horror, stretching all the way back to the Gothics and the pulps, all the way to now. I would argue it goes back even before recorded history. If you look at the cave paintings our ancestors made, many of the crude images on those rock walls depict things they were terrified of, beasts that could eat them. Telling stories about those beasts helped them cope and deal with it. And that has continued throughout human history. Things like EC Comics, splatterpunk, the 90s horror boom, the 2000s horror boom, and today's current indie horror revolution, all of these were in direct correlation to what was happening in the world at the time. For my generation and Mary's generation of writers, we rose to prominence and popularity in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks and the subsequent war on terror. Why? Because the world was a scary place. People were flying airplanes into buildings and going off to fight wars in places that had nothing to do with that, marching blindly, fueled by the conviction that somebody, anybody, had to pay. There is comfort in the safety of monsters like vampires and zombies and werewolves because those things don't exist in the real world. In the real world, the monsters are shooting up schools, abducting children, raping the environment, and rolling back basic human rights and farming our personal lives as data for mega corporations and killing each other based on political opinions or gender or sexual persuasion or the color of their skin. We know these things exist because they happen all around us every day. Real monsters are beating their spouses and children or filming crime victims with their phones for social media clicks rather than calling 911. There is a safety and a comfort in curling up with make-believe monsters so that we can tune out the very real monsters all around us, even if only for a little while. But horror also gives us a way to talk about and tackle those real monsters. George Romero's Land of the Dead is a zombie movie, but it's also about the reign of George W. Bush. Stephen King's Salem's Lot is a novel about vampires, but it's also about the death of small-town America. His 2011 novel, 11/22/63, is ostensibly about time travel, but at its core, it's a story about the fear of growing old and about unrequited love. J.F. Gonzalez's Survivor is a book about a snuff film ring, but it's really a stark and terrifying examination of what the internet and streaming content are doing to us as human beings and the limits we're willing to push in the quest for more content. I say here in the essay that I'm in my mid-50s as I write this. I'm actually 57. I am far removed from that little boy who was uneasy with the off-kilter world around him. But there are still things I dread, things I fear. I'm afraid of getting older. I fear for my children and this world they're inheriting from us. I fear that I can no longer protect them, keep them safe. I fear for my parents, who seem to be shrinking before my eyes, growing frailer and more unsteady with each passing year. And over the past few years, many of my close friends have died. And I fear that with each passing month, it seems to leave me a little bit more alone. I fear. And so, I still hide inside stories about monsters as a coping mechanism for that fear. And I write stories about monsters so that others have a coping mechanism as well. I think often about a reader of mine, a young mother in Canada whose baby was diagnosed with cancer when he was still an infant. For the first several years of that child's life, they lived in a hospital room. The only thing she had to keep her company were my books. I helped in some small way to get her through it. My stupid stories about zombies and satyrs and sentient darkness and giant man-eating worms helped her cope, helped her find some respite from the very real monster of childhood illness. On days when the business side of writing for a living is wearing me down, or when the words aren't coming the way I need them to, or when some asshole says something unkind online and I have to get involved, I remember her, and then I get back to work. I'll take a giant-sized man-thing over cancer, or a blood-sucking vampire over a data-stealing corporation, or a demonically possessed girl over a fascist political pundit, or a swarm of killer bees over the spray of a mass shooter's bullets any day of the week. And that is why I love horror. So again, the book is called Why I Love Horror, on sale September 2025. If you enjoyed my essay, the book is full of even better essays than that. I think mine's the worst in there. I don't know why they opened the book with mine. Mary's shaking her head no. You would say yours is the best, right? I don't know what you're doing now. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Please buy the book. We'll see you soon. Peace.